back, most of you who have made it this far. Dr. Jason W. Morrison, theologist. I'm trying to do a theological audit, which is straightening out theology. In the Watchtower study article 41 of the Watchtower study edition for October 2019, Staying Faithful Through the Tribulation, and it's turned out to be a bit of a rabbit hole of theological mess suited to their organisation. But I've come up to this one, paragraph 12. How has the faithful and discreet slave been preparing us for what is coming in the future? Now, identifying the faithful and discreet slave, oh my gosh, I don't know how they've come up with the idea that they are the faithful and discreet slave, but nevertheless they have. And it's this guy, a bunch of people, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society governing body. I don't know all the I know Anthony Morris, I know Garrett Loesch, Jeffrey Jackson, Samuel Hurd, Stephen Lett. Not sure of this bloke, and I'm not sure of that bloke, but I do believe, is that Cook? That guy there, I'm not sure, but this is the governing body of the Jehovah Witnesses. Interesting bunch of people. They're leading the deception. To be honest, the only way I can say it is they're leading the deception, but these people are highly theologically deceived. I don't know how else you can put it. It's just the way it is. But thinking they're the faithful and discreet slave of Matthew. And I think we'll go to Matthew 24 in its entirety. This passage is gone over and over. People have gone over and over this again and again and again. Who really is the faithful and discreet slave whom his master appointed over his domestics to give them food, give them their food at the proper time? Happy is that slave if his master on coming finds him doing so. Well, the poor old faithful and discreet slave's in for a shock because they've been lying to their members. Now, I do know that the Berean picket man, here he is here, he's uploaded a new video, and it's examining Matthew 24, part 5, the answer. I think this goes for 26 minutes, and I'm going to put this in now. I'm sure he won't mind. He's got a really good subscriber base. Very intelligent man. I'm going to run his video now and see how we go with this idea that the governing body thinks they're the faithful and discreet slave of Matthew 24. My goodness me. I've talk about use religion as a business shopfront. These guys are the best in the business. I tell you, they've made billions, not millions, billions out of religion. So I'm going to run Berean pickets now, and we'll have a talk at the end.
Who really is the faithful and discreet slave whom his master appointed over his domestics to give them their food at the proper time? That is the question that Jesus asks his disciples at Matthew 24:45. Today, Jehovah's Witnesses identify this parable with their leadership, the governing body. Now, at the outset, I want to be clear, and I discussed this in my video, Make Sure of All Things. I fully support the idea of Christian leadership and authority. But at the same time, that authority is always subject to God's word, and it should never be based upon false pretenses. For some years, Jehovah's Witnesses actually identified Charles Russell as the faithful slave. But then over time, they began to conclude that it was actually a composite slave made up collectively of all so-called anointed Christians, members of the 144,000 spoken of in Revelation 7 and 14, and they identify these as a distinct group of Christians. They are to be the sole members of the New Covenant, the only ones who are born again, and in fact distinct with a different hope than the vast majority of Christians today whom they maintain are not born again at all. So in doing this, with this interpretation, they were able to maintain that the faithful slave had existed since the first century, and they were arguing that there were really very few Christians in the first century, and all true Christians then and subsequently until relatively modern times were of this group of 144,000, were of this faithful slave class. As all such ones today are said to be Jehovah's Witnesses, as the one true religion, the governing body was identified as the representative of the faithful slave, and so they were acting on the slave's behalf. But in 2013, this all changed. No longer was it the entire group of the 144,000 who were understood to be this slave. Instead, it was just the governing body. Simply put, the governing body determined that the governing body was appointed as the slave since 1919. But of course, the interesting result of this was that Joseph Rutherford was actually and essentially the slave himself, because during his presidency, there wasn't really a governing body at all. He was the president and the doctrinal authority of the organization, and then following him, what became a group and a succession of individuals with that group became the faithful slave. But according to Jehovah's Witnesses, they were and are, that is the governing body, the ones doing the work that Christ spoke of and giving the proper food at the proper time, that is spiritual food. They were the ones that Christ spoke of with this parable 2,000 years ago. This interpretation, however, has introduced some exegetical problems that even 3 years later now, since they've released this new interpretation, they haven't even attempted to address them. Frankly, I'm not sure they're even aware of the issues that they've introduced. But more so, the problem really ultimately comes down to a lack of a biblical foundation for the precise level of authority they claim to have. And that, of course, that this was allegedly given to them during the year 1919 and is somehow transferred to individuals who take the lead today. Now, to get into the parable itself and to set the stage, before we jump into Matthew 24:45, let's go back into verse 43. And it says here, "But know one thing, that if the householder had known in what watch the thief was coming, he would have kept awake and not allowed his house to be broken into." The illustration set before Jesus' disciples was that Christians are to be ready just as a householder would be ready for a thief. Christ was going to be coming back, and they didn't know when it was going to be. So it was important that they're always diligent, always ready for him to return at any time. And then he continues in verse 44, "On this account, you too prove yourselves ready, because at an hour that you do not think it to be, the Son of Man is coming." We don't know when a thief is going to try to break into our house. The thief intentionally tries to make it unexpected. And so similarly, we don't know when Christ is going to return. When it comes to a thief, what do? We lock our doors, we lock our windows. If we have an alarm, we set the alarm. We do everything we can to prepare for a thief to come just in case it happens. And so we treat Christ's return similarly. We do everything we need to do to prepare for him to return and how we live our lives, always being faithful to him. Now, the parable of the faithful slave comes next. In verse 45, it starts, "Who really is the faithful and discreet slave, whom his master appointed over his domestics to give them their food at the proper time? Happy is that slave if his master on coming finds him doing so. Truly I say to you, he will appoint him over all his belongings." Now, this here is followed by a reference to an evil slave who would beat his fellow servants. But rather than try to offer an interpretation for all this at this point, let's actually continue in the text to get some more information from Jesus himself. The scene here continues into Matthew 25. The context doesn't change. The chapter break is completely artificial. And so in chapter 25, Jesus goes on to speak about the 10 virgins, 5 of them who were ready for the bridegroom to return and 5 were not. And the point of this illustration is summarized in verse 13. "Keep on the watch, Therefore, because you know neither the day nor the hour. We're here presented with now two different illustrations that bookend the parable about the faithful slave, both having the same purpose. Jesus was instructing his disciples to be ready. The parable of the faithful slave, again, is sandwiched right in between these other two. So it's strikingly out of place if this is instead a parable about future, that is nearly 2,000 years later, Christian leadership. Were this about a small group of future Christian leaders who would take the lead, there would be a significant topical shift away from the parable of the householder on the importance of being ready for Christ's return to the topic of future Christian leadership, only to immediately return to the topic of Christian readiness with the parable of the virgins. So wouldn't it really make more sense for this to just be another way that Jesus is illustrating the same point about the need for his disciples to be ready for his return? Would the faithful slave not be in the illustration what all Christians should try to attain to, just as they would all want to be as the householder who was ready for the thief and the 5 virgins who were prepared for the bridegroom to return? And then similarly, wouldn't the evil slave not be the same thing as the householder not ready for the thief and the 5 virgins who were not ready for the bridegroom? Now, we can press the illustration and we can look to each individual element to have some type of fulfillment. So we can say, what is the food and what is this element and what is that element? But the thing is it's not really clear that we should be doing that at all. The Watchtower itself has backed away from pressing illustrations in this way, which is not to say we can't find significance in each of these points, and we'll discuss that a little bit later, but we need to be very careful about this. Now, if there is still question, though, as to what the faithful slave illustration is for, we can actually look to Luke's parallel account to have this cleared up. In Luke 12, Jesus had been talking both to his disciples and to a larger crowd of people, in contrast to Matthew 24, where he was only speaking to his disciples. And in Luke 12, he's often directing his comments either to one group or the other. We see in verse 1, for example, he spoke to his disciples. In verse 14, to a man from the larger crowd. In verse 15, to the whole crowd. In verse 22, he goes back to speaking to his disciples. And we're going to pick this up now in verse 39. It says, "But know this, if the householder had known at what hour the thief would come, he would not have let his house be broken into. You also keep ready, because at an hour you do not think likely the Son of Man is coming." Jesus has now given the same parable and comments that we find recorded at Matthew 24, 43, and 44. His goal again, though, was to give instructions about being ready for the end. However, there's 2 distinct audiences here, not just the one, both the larger crowd and his disciples. So Peter asks a logical question in verse 41. It says, "Then Peter said, 'Lord, are you telling this illustration just to us, or also to everyone?'" A.T. Robertson rightly notes that Peter knew that they, as disciples, were being addressed. This is really clear when he says, "just to us or also to everyone." How Jesus answered now is really revealing on this issue. In verse 42, it picks up, "And the Lord said, 'Who really is the faithful steward, the discreet one, whom his master will appoint over his body of attendants to keep giving them their measure of food supplies at the proper time? Happy is that slave if his master on coming finds him doing so.'" The answer to Peter's question was the parable of the faithful slave. But in this account, he uses the term steward, which really is appropriate because a steward was one placed over another's household affairs. Christ's answer to Peter about whom he is addressing then is to give this parable. So there are several problems then that are presented by this for the Watchtower's view, that Jesus was speaking of a governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses. We recall that the Watchtower teaches that the parable was only fulfilled since 1919. If that is the case, then Jesus' answer to Peter's question of whether he was talking only to his disciples or to everyone was essentially to say, "I'm not talking to any of you, without actually saying
Peter was
mistaken in thinking that Jesus spoke to those disciples there present when he had spoken about being ready for his return. Instead, he didn't speak to anybody there with him at that time, but only with the intention that a group nearly 2,000 years later would read his recorded words and find application in themselves. But Jesus does nothing to correct Peter's view, and Luke certainly doesn't suggest in any type of commentary that Peter was in error. Instead, we find language that can be interpreted to mean that Jesus was speaking to anyone who was a faithful disciple of his. But Jesus didn't stop there. He gave in this illustration 3 additional servants. In verses 45 through 46, he considers the evil servant who beat his disciples, or his fellow servants. And we also find this in Matthew's account. But then there are 2 additional types of servants. Notice in verse 47, then the slave who understood the will of his master, but did not get ready or do what he asked, will be beaten with many strokes. But the one who did not understand and yet did things deserving of strokes will be beaten with few. Indeed, everyone to whom much was given, much will be demanded of him. And the one who was put in charge of much will have more than the usual demanded of him. So there is a servant who knows the master's will, but doesn't do it. They aren't the evil slave assigned a place with the unfaithful and treated as a wicked person, but they are severely punished. The implication of this is that there would be ones who are Christians, but who knowingly do the things that they're not supposed to do, or not do the things they're supposed to do. Then there would be a Christian who didn't know what they were supposed to do. They acted out of ignorance. And so this one would be punished as well, but not as severely as the other. So the implication of these different servants is revealing. In Matthew 24, the Watchtower has argued that the governing body as a group is the faithful slave, and that the evil slave is simply a warning for them not to fall away, but not a possible reality. Yet Luke provides these other accounts as definite realities. If the faithful slave is a small group, it follows that these other 2 slaves must be something similar. But no such groups can be pointed to today. There are groups that are not composite slaves. So to review, the Watchtower's interpretation has 3 difficulties. 1, Jesus would not have been speaking to anyone he was actually speaking to. 2, Peter's question affirms that Jesus was speaking to his disciples, and there's no denial or dispute by Jesus directly or in Luke's commentary. And 3, Jesus illustrates 2 additional slaves that are not groups or classes. When Jehovah's Witnesses moved away from their previous interpretation concerning the slave as all of the 144,000, they introduced an impossible interpretation in light of the context of Luke 12's parallel account. But these are not the only difficulties. For example, Jehovah's Witnesses believe that Jesus only appointed the slave following his invisible return in 1914 after an inspection period. But not only is this entire notion of such an inspection and selection not biblical, the parable finds that the slave was appointed before the master departs. And this would take us all the way back to the 1st century. So how then do we understand this passage? Within the confines of Matthew, we saw that the faithful slave parable was bookended by parables concerning being ready for Christ's return, and this was applied to all Christians, suggesting that this parable, the faithful slave, has a similar purpose. Bringing in Luke's account, we find that there would be various types of Christians. Not only would there be faithful servants, there would be wicked ones, and there would be those who were still his servants but might not follow him fully for various reasons. It's questionable how far we should apply each element of the parables to Christians, a point that, again, even the Watchtower has acknowledged concerning the parable of the 10 virgins. However, we might glean from it that there are those who are truly faithful Christians and whom Christ will appoint over his belongings in his kingdom. In other words, all such faithful ones will be those who stuck by him, and they will be the ones who are the members of the kingdom covenant to rule with Christ. But of course, it is just a parable, and we shouldn't press it too much beyond the general ideas conveyed. Now, this being said, Scripture expects all Christians to be faithful stewards. In 1 Peter 4:10, we're told, to the extent that each one has received a gift, use it in ministering to one another as fine stewards of God's undeserved kindness that is expressed in various ways. Given the context and all that is said in and around the two accounts in Matthew 24 and Luke 12, there's no doubt that this wasn't a prophecy concerning a small group of men leading Jehovah's Witnesses that formed in the 20th century. Instead, we are all to be stewards of one another, giving each other the proper food at the proper time, doing what our fellow Christians need from us. All Christians are to strive to be the faithful slave. The parable is illustrating what we need to do to be ready and faithful at the time of Christ's return. If you found the content of this video beneficial, please go ahead and like it because it's going to make it easier for other people to find this video as well. Additionally, here are some other videos I think you'll enjoy.
Yeah, Dr. Jason Morrison, theologist again. I just want to say thank you for watching the videos, and I hope you got plenty of self-rediscovery and freedom out of it. If you watched it on YouTube, please share or like, maybe even comment. If you watch it on Facebook, like, comment, share. But most of all, get out and live. This isn't a rehearsal. You've got a one-off life. Don't let your loyalty and your faithfulness blind you to the life that you should be experiencing. Till the next video, thank you for watching, and bye for now.